Okay, if you're a fan of Meatloaf, I think you're going to really enjoy this video. Now, if you follow this channel, you know that when I say the word meatloaf, there's no way I'm talking about the food. I'm actually talking about Meatloaf, the singer. And what I did is I went and did some research in some old newspapers, and I was looking for reviews for the album Bat Out of Hell. And back in 1977, when the album was put out, did you see what was being said at the time about the record? Now, here's one of my copies of Bat Out of Hell. I always loved this cover. Thought it was pretty cool. And then here's the back. There's Meatloaf. There's Jim Steinman. And it had the song Bat Out of Hell was so great. It was such an awesome song. And then 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad was great. But one of the most fantastic, amazing rock and roll songs ever created, Paradise by the Dashboard Light. It is so spectacular. And it's on this album, and it has everything that you would ever want in a great piece of music. Anyway, it's one of the, for me, it's one of the greatest songs ever recorded. And of course, this album was produced by Todd Rundgren, who he had a huge career outside as a musician himself, but he's the one that was the visionary that knew what to do with this record. And he's the reason that a song like Paradise by the Dashboard Light turned out the way that it did. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read this review to you. And I think you're going to enjoy this because they have so many kind of interesting things about the people involved with the record and the record itself. And again, the reason I love this so much is that we have so much hindsight. Hey, hold on for just a second. We'll get right back to the video. But if you like this stuff, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave any comments. We'd love to hear from you, and we really, really appreciate it. Anyway, with that, back to the video. This review was written, almost 50 years ago, right after the album came out. And it's so fascinating to hear what people were saying at the time. Okay, so here it goes. This is from the Sunday Record, November 20th, 1977, by Rick Atkinson. And the title of this article is Meatloaf Takes Off Like a Bat. Okay, here's the article. One of the fastest rising stars in the rock firmament is the singer known as Meatloaf, creator of the epic Cleveland International Records album Bat Out of Hell. In the wake of massive airplay, snowballing record sales, and a hugely successful New York area debut 2 weeks ago at Creations in West Orange, Meatloaf's unlikely name is making its way to the list of rock's superstars. Interestingly, Bat Out of Hell is not Meatloaf's album alone. It is a joint project Meatloaf undertook with his partner, pianist-songwriter Jim Steinman, and producer-musician Todd Rundgren. Now, this is a really important thing if you know anything about the history of this record. Because this guy, as he writes this review, when you look at this album, naturally, it's Meatloaf. And that's the focus of who the artist is that made this thing. And then down here, in very small letters, it says songs by Jim Steinman. Now, this was something of a dispute, and it caused a little bit of bad blood. Because these songs, this whole thing, the vision really was Jim Steinman's. Meatloaf was, for all intents and purposes, a face, a singer, a guy that had a big personality and a big voice. But he's the one that became the focus of the attention, while Jim Steinman, who was kind of the genius behind it, was severely downplayed. And the fact that it wasn't Meatloaf and Steinman, which is what it was supposed to be, that it was just Meatloaf, and then Steinman's like, afterthought, throw him down at the bottom, was kind of a sore spot for a long, long time with these two. And anyway, and it's reflected here in the article. Interestingly, because as he puts it, interestingly, it's not just Meatloaf. There's other guys involved. And it's like, well, actually, if you flip it around, it's more like Meatloaf was the extra guy because the geniuses that put all the music together, Jim Steinman wrote all this stuff, and then Todd Rundgren knew how to organize it and produce it. And then that's what made it great. And then Meatloaf just happened to be the big personality and singer, but he really was. The guy was a great singer, huge personality, and just an interesting person. Because he was this huge guy, and you just didn't expect what came out of him when it did. Okay, so anyway, moving on. The division of labor has Steinman writing all the songs, Meatloaf singing all the lead vocals, and Rundgren leading the backing band and producing the album. Meatloaf was born 28 years ago to Wesley and Wilma Aday, now both deceased, in Dallas, Texas. He does not reveal his real name on the grounds that Meatloaf is now his real name. But he will grudgingly admit that the initials ML fit both his old name and his new one. I didn't choose the name, he said. People just started calling me that. I've been called Meatloaf for 16 years now, so why change it? I'm used to it now. Yeah, isn't that interesting that he was, as I understand it, it was kind of like people kind of poking fun at him when he was a kid because he was this kind of overweight kid and they just called him Meatloaf. Although he was born into a family of gospel singers, Meatloaf first applied his talents to football. His career as a singer started when a string of injuries, a trick knee, a separated shoulder, and 11 concussions, he proudly lists, forced him out of football. I don't remember starting as a singer, really, he said. I was playing football at the time, and they told me not to play football anymore. I didn't want to go to work, so I got into singing. Let me rephrase that, because this singing is an awful lot of work. I wasn't interested in going into a 9-to-5 job. I could have been an accountant, but I didn't want to do it. So I had to find something else, and this was it. Since his beginning in show business, Meatloaf has kept his feet in two camps at once, working in both rock and roll and musical theater. He made an album for Motown Records as early as 1970 and has since been involved in diverse projects such as playing a leading role in the Los Angeles and New York productions of the musical The Rocky Horror Picture Show, recreating that role for the Rocky Horror Picture Show, playing in a New York Shakespeare Festival production, and singing lead vocals on guitarist Ted Nugent's platinum album Free For All. Now, they don't say it very clearly, I don't think, when you read this here, but Rocky Horror Picture Show, he's in the movie. So if you ever go see the movie Rocky Horror Picture Show and you see the guy that's on the motorcycle and he comes out of the deep freeze, and as I recall, the story escapes me. I've seen it a few times, actually in theaters where the craziness happens. He comes out of the deep freeze, and that's where they got the brain for Rocky, is they pulled it out of this guy that Meatloaf plays, as I recall. And it's kind of this gory moment as he brings this motorcycle out, starts riding around, and then, anyway, chaos ensues. Just put it that way. But anyway, so he was in that B movie, Rocky Horror Picture Show, and when you go back, that was, even though the movie at the time was downplayed as kind of silly, campy goofiness, it carried on this kind of cult status. It still does over the years, and anyway, he was in that. His songwriting partner Steinman is a 27-year-old native of Claremont, California, who later moved to Long Island. He is a hard worker who fuses a finely honed writing talent with an interest in the theater and a sly sense of humor that shows through both in his work and conversation. He remembers very clearly his introduction to his current partner. Quote, "We met in New York about 3 years ago," Steinman said. "Actually, we met in a lot of places, the most focused of which was at the New York Shakespeare Festival, where I was doing a musical I wrote called More Than You Deserve, and Meat was in it. Since we were in the same show, we tended to meet in odd places like rehearsals and such. We found a mutual interest in rock and roll, so we started working together. As we got more and more into rock and roll, we did less and less theater. We finally ended up in a National Lampoon show together, and I suspect that is that it was at that time that we worked most intensely on what we were aiming for." The entire Bat Outta Hell project finally got off the ground when Meatloaf and Jim Steinman met producer Todd Rundgren. Now, this is an interesting thing. I'm just going to put a side note in here. These guys wrote these songs. Jim Steinman wrote these songs, and then Meatloaf, of course, is singing them. And he has his big boisterous way of wearing that tuxedo, and he has the little handkerchief that he throws around. And apparently what had happened is they had gone to many, many record companies. And what they would do is Steinman would just sit and play the piano, and Meatloaf be holding his handkerchief and be singing these big songs, these big epic things that they'd put on this record. And the record companies would look at him like, I don't get it. And then they would just never do anything with them. And as you hear some of the stories as they talk about it, they'd met with record companies on multiple occasions, even different record companies, and just nobody knew what to do with them. And then it was finally Rundgren. And if you know a little bit about Rundgren, he's always kind of trying new things, doing different stuff. And when he saw them, he kind of had this, okay, I get it. I know what to do with this. And then he's the one that ended up really, making it happen. So here we go. He came to us, actually, Meatloaf said, through a friend of his and an acquaintance of ours named Moogie Klingman, who used to be Todd's keyboard player in Utopia. Moogie called him up and said that we were looking for a producer, and Todd said that he was looking for someone to produce. Todd came in and he really understood what we were going through and what we wanted to do and how we wanted to put it across. We hadn't run into anyone up to that point who had understood all those things. We decided that we wanted to do it with Todd, but the record company decided that it wasn't a good idea for us to work with him. So we found a new record company. Probably the most fascinating thing about Steinman's songs is their tendency to either complete a story or run full cycle. The song 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad is a perfect example. The song's final verse explains the one phrase around which the song revolves, and in so doing gives the entire song new meaning. I really love doing that, Steinman said. It's just kind of an instinct. I think that might be influenced by my theatrical background. And it's really true when you listen to this album, it really does have the sound of a rock opera, more so than a pop, a rock pop album. And again, you go listen to what I think is, again, one of the greatest songs ever recorded. There's so many great things on here, but Paradise by the Dashboard Lights, it's a story. And you listen to this and you can hear the theater influence in it and all the movements. And again, and if you listen to, and if you're familiar with rock operas, especially back in that era, like Jesus Christ Superstar, and you can hear that kind of thing in the music. You know that's where it came from. There's this theater background. You can sense it. Let's see here. I'm fascinated by songs that have inner cycles. It's similar to a certain cinematic effect, but I can't get a handle on what it's called right now. You hear or see something that has a certain meaning all the way through until you find one clue phrase, and then everything that is past takes on new meaning. I guess that happens partly because I see my songs like little movies. They're very cinematic, and they're quite like little musical films in my mind. And again, I know I keep bringing this song up, but Paradise by the Dashboard Light, it has this whole circle. And it's so funny because there's a punchline in the very last few seconds of the song. You get through this whole thing. You're watching this evening play out between these two people, and it goes on for this long song, and then at the very end, it twists it on you, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's one of the most brilliant pieces of music I've ever heard in my life. It's so great. Anyway, as a careful and painstaking composer, one might assume that Steinman has a favorite among the Bat Outta Hell songs. Not so. I probably had a favorite song before they were recorded, he said, but in recording a song goes through so many transformations that it's impossible for me to objectify it and think of them as just songs. If I take one song now, it is just inextricably connected with all of the hassles of that particular recording session, of bad hamburgers coming in that day or whatever. Those things all just emerge until the song becomes the experience of working with it. I don't really have a favorite. In one sense, I think Bat Outta Hell is my favorite because it was very ambitious, but it was easier to work on than some of the other ambitious ones. And that song, my personal notes again, what a great tune. I mean, it's just, and Meatloaf's vocal execution on it, the song is so great. Anyway, it really does rank up there. That song alone, Bat Outta Hell, is just one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. And again, it's one of the reasons this album, I don't know what the final number is. And when you start talking about some of these albums like Michael Jackson's Thriller, you'll hear everything from 40 million to 70 million records sold on that one. Of course, Michael Jackson Thriller, #1 selling album of all time. I've heard in some statistics, this one as being the second biggest selling, although I don't know. There's a whole bunch of different records that are supposedly up there, but this one is up in that 30, 40 million range of sales on this record. It was such a big deal. Let's see here. Some of the others. If I hadn't written that one, I would still enjoy it because it's a vision I particularly like. The best song would either be that or For Crying Out Loud or Heaven Can't Wait. Those would be the three. But as much for any personal resonance they have for me as for any compositional excellence, after a while they cease to be songs for me and start to be symbols. What an interesting insight. Anyway, Jim Steinman, fascinating composer, incredible music. Of course, we've lost both of these guys now. Jim Steinman and Meat Loaf are both gone. But this album, I just think it's interesting to go back and listen to the words being said at the time, what people were saying. It's one thing to hear people talking about, Jim Steinman talking about it 30 years later. It's another thing to listen to how people were reacting to it as it was happening. So anyway, I hope you enjoy that stuff. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel. If you know anybody else that was into Meatloaf that would be interested in hearing this old article, go ahead and share this with them and follow our channel, of course. And with that, as always, have a fantastic day.